Yesterday, when the announcements came out about the players that were suspended, I think there was about 11 or 12 that were announced, and I kept looking at it saying, like, yeah, but when's the news about A-Rod? The A-Rod news came later on, and if you're talking about putting the cart before the horse, or vice versa, David, when that story first broke, were you one of those guys who were thinking, like, who cares about anybody else? I want to see what they're going to do to A-Rod?
Not necessarily. I was curious to see if any of the other players listed would get more than the first-time offender 50 games. I was also curious to see, if any of the players originally listed in reports would be cleared, and a couple of players were. And also, finally, curious to see if they'd try to double dip and get someone like Melky Cabrera from the Jays, even though he'd already been suspended, and obviously he wasn't suspended again. So there was some intrigue, although admittedly A-Rod's the bigger name.
Yeah, A-Rod played last night. He's indicating that he will definitely appeal it. I don't know if the process, if he has to put in a formal application today. You can discuss that in a minute or so from now. But he played last night against Chicago. He had a hit and a strikeout, but I mean, basically every time he went to the plate, they were booing him, and it wouldn't be uncommon for an opposing team's player to be booed. But I think this was a boo that was more about what he's done and basically how I think he's really hurting baseball. I think his image has been tarnished beyond anything he can do. So, what are your thoughts basically about the length of the suspension and his desire? Or his decision anyway to appeal it?
Well, as far as the length, I mean, short of a lifetime ban, this is the longest punishment in baseball history. So it's either been a lifetime ban or it's been this. So purely off numbers, it's enormous. Obviously, he is arguably the least likable player in baseball right now. So there's going to be vicious boos. There's going to be unhappiness with the fact that he's able to continue to play and none of the other players implicated in this scandal are. But at the same time, there is an obligation for due process. There are confidentiality obligations that were failed here, and I think one of the themes of this finality, or at least some semblance of finality, is that the Players Association has been negotiating hard to reach cooperation with MLB, settle these disputes, but even the Players Association, who represent players that want a clean game, have drawn a line and said, with this 200-plus game punishment, it's unprecedented, it's not specified in the joint drug agreement, and even we, the Players Association, who want a clean game at this point, are saying, you've overstepped your bounds, Major League Baseball, and we're going to assist A-Rod in his appeal.
So, and again, was it just strictly, from what you understand, it has to do specifically with him or specifically with the length of the suspension? From what you're saying is they weren't too concerned or too bothered by the fact that there was a suspension, but the fact they've perhaps gone, maybe even because it is historic setting, that's what they just want to address. So going forward, to have some sort of language or some sort of written document, legal document that puts this in place.
You're right. They want to prevent baseball from being able to do something like this again. They don't want that precedent set cleanly. So the Players Association represents the players of Major League Baseball, and the tide has turned to the point where, based on whether it's Twitter reaction or just strictly what the PA is feeling obligated to do, players want to get rid of steroids at this point, and they're when this first came out, the assumption was they'll appeal anything. In fact, they're not appealing anything except one. The Players Association is essentially saying, we're okay with there being punishments here. We're okay, even though drug tests weren't failed by any of these players, we've seen baseball's evidence. We're satisfied that it's overwhelming enough to accept these punishments. However, there is no basis for 200-plus games. There's no legal, this is the Players Association argument and A-Rod's argument. There's no legal basis for the extent, so I think it's less about that he's being punished and strictly, or at least much more about how long he's being punished for.
We saw the whole situation with Roger Clemens and the lengths he went to basically absolve himself of any guilt. And, there'd been all this kind of speculation that he was going to go to jail and this and that. At the end of the day, he was acquitted. I'm not sure whether anybody would totally believe it, and having said that, if he did steroids, fine. I mean, it's not like we can in any way compare this to like O.J. Simpson. Like, do you believe him or not? If you're somebody like A-Rod, are you doing this basically to preserve your what's left of your reputation, or all the things you've done in baseball, or is it basically trying to say that you honestly do believe in your heart and in your head that you haven't done anything wrong, and it's not that someone else has to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt?
Well, I can't speak for him, but one thing that's different between A-Rod and someone like Clemens is A-Rod has admitted in the past that he's done this. He admitted that he used from 2001 to 2003. He admitted for sure that he used before 2003. So, unlike Clemens and some of the other players who've denied this and continue to deny it, A-Rod hasn't. He's admitted it in the past. I think there are a few reasons A-Rod would fight this. One, from a purely skeptical financial point of view, he makes much more money this year than he does next, and he makes more next year than he would in the following years. So if he's able to continue playing, he's able to continue being paid. So, he saves some money that way. And while it's not a ton compared to how much he's made over his career, it's still real dollars, and it's millions of them. So that's one element. The other is, he's 38. So unlike Ryan Braun, who's got, much of his career ahead of him, even if he sits and accepts the rest of this season's punishment, if A-Rod misses the rest of this season, those are games he can't get back at the post-suspension level because he's going to be in his 40s and arguably may not be ready to play in any event. So I think those are just a couple of the reasons. In addition to, at a purely principled level, I'm sure his lawyer is telling him, again, from their point of view, this is a unprecedented and without basis extension of baseball's authority.
He's 38 years old. If he was to be suspended for that period of time, by the time he came back, and this is a player who's gone through a variety of injuries, I just wonder if the suspension goes through, will he be able to come back after that? I have to think that just because of his sheer ego, he'd want to try and come back, but I just don't see his value anymore. Certainly the rift that's been caused between him and the Yankees over the recent one about whether he was healthy, whether he wasn't healthy. I just see this being just a real volatile, it's an ugly situation, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely, and it's, the relationship between A-Rod and the Yankees is about as poisoned as one can imagine at this point. There is distrust going both ways, public inflammatory statements going both ways, and obviously a less than ideal environment to bring someone back who, as you mentioned earlier, is not particularly popular with the fans as it is. So the Yankees arguably are quite happy with this. They save a lot of money. They get rid of a headache for a little while at least. And again, still lingering, out there as a possibility is that they may try to void his contract, which, depending on what comes out through arbitration, may actually be made easier, depending on the evidence that baseball does release.
Do you know how long it is going to be before that comes down, the arbitration ruling?
Depends on basically people's schedules. I suspect that it'll be into September. The arbitrator is Frederick Horowitz. He's the independent arbitrator who'll be ruling on this, but it's him, it's the various lawyers on different sides. It's not something that can happen, unfortunately, tomorrow or anything immediate.
I guess baseball, if it had the choice, it would rather have this done as immediately as possible, and if you're A-Rod, you'd probably want to let it drag on as long as possible so you can continue playing.
Exactly. I think that's a fair estimation.
One thing I'm also concerned about, it's one thing you could take money out of his pocket, but if Major League Baseball decided, you know what, we want to remove some of his statistics forevermore, just wipe them out as our kind of way of saying, this isn't good. We saw what happened with the whole Joe Paterno situation, and as really, you can't compare them in any way, but what the NCAA did in terms of the sanctions against Joe Paterno, do you ever think Major League Baseball would try to do something like that?
I doubt it, only because they haven't taken any steps like that yet. And to me, it just doesn't make sense that they would. They're fighting enough fights as it is. There are enough questions about what they are and aren't allowed to do, whether or not they've acted properly in these suspensions. So it would be a completely unprecedented step. I mean, college sports does it to questionable value, removing banners and removing teams from the record books, but I'm not sure how effective that is in either punishing or deterring. And I just haven't seen baseball having an inclination to take that step, and I'd be surprised if they went that far at this point.
Dave, what's your Twitter account again?
It's D Goldstein 79.
Okay, the reason I'm saying that is I've been away for a week or so, took a little vacation, but have you been tweeting about this?
I do. It's it's such an interesting and fast-moving story that you kind of have to. Obviously, there's full-time reporters on it who are getting a lot of the nitty-gritty out. I try to take a little bit of a different angle where I can.
Well, what is it?
I think for this, I think the fascinating thing to me as a lawyer, one of them from the beginning of this process has been the Players Association's role in this. They have a really difficult conflict position where they are both defending athletes that are being charged and punished with things, and at the same time representing all of the athletes who want a clean game and don't necessarily want the PA spending all their time and effort and resources defending players who should be out of baseball from their position. So it's a really difficult spot. I think they've done a tremendous job. They've negotiated extremely hard. As I mentioned, none of the 12 players suspended yesterday, other than A-Rod, got more than the 50-game suspension when there had been implications and rumors that they'd get more than 50. So obviously the negotiations worked to some extent, and at the same time we're not seeing 13 appeals back-to-back going into months and months and months from now.
And I think that if there's one good thing about this, it's that at least some players have taken responsibility. Obviously, they're not going to be suspended as long as A-Rod, but they've taken their medicine. They've been grown-ups, and they'll move forward with their careers. I guess at the end of the day, one can only assume what it would be like for them if they were in A-Rod's shoes, facing this type of suspension, this potential loss of money, and potential that their career may be over, because it could be possibly be over.
Exactly, and as unlikable as he may be for whatever reason, he's still an individual with rights. He's still suffering a severe financial loss. And one of the things I think the PA has done well is drawn a line and said this is an unreasonable breach of due process, and they've really harped on, and I think fairly, the breaches of confidentiality, the number of leaks, the consistency of leaks, the timing. It's really been a very tough thing to watch, because there are confidentiality provisions all over the collective agreement and the joint drug agreement, and they just haven't worked. So that's one thing I suspect that the PA will want to look at going forward for sure.